I'm a political theorist, and political theorists have a habit of seeking inspiration from the words of long dead and forgotten philosophers and theorists. And if you'll indulge me tonight, I'd like to draw upon the words of the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder, who once wrote, "The savage who loves himself, his wife, and his child, and works for the good of his tribe as for his own, is, in my view, more genuine than that cultivated ghost, the citizen of the world, who, burning with love for all his fellow ghosts, loves a chimera. The savage in his hut has room for any stranger. The saturated heart of the superfluous cosmopolitan is a home for no one." This evening, I'd like to make the case for the savage over the civilized ghost, to argue that on the matter of climate change, we are better off thinking as patriots, motivated by a love of our tribe, than as cosmopolitans, moved by a love of humanity. Now, I should like to make clear one thing at the outset. There is in my mind no doubt that climate change presents some profound moral and ethical challenges, that it demands a concerted and coordinated international response. But the temptation is to conclude that a global problem requires a global solution, and indeed, a global morality. Parochial national interests, so the argument runs, must be subordinated to the interests of humanity at large. Global responsibility must trump national patriotism. And where we fail to change our behaviour, fail to recognise the magnitude of the threat of climate change to our planet, we are guilty of a grave immorality. Such thinking, while in a way elegant, in the end falls short of motivating the right kind of action needed on climate change. There are, I believe, serious limits to approaching climate change as primarily or exclusively a political problem, and this has become all too apparent in recent months. For we may talk about climate change as the greatest moral challenge of our time, but where does that leave us when there's no action to back the rhetoric? Where does it leave us when, for all the talk of global responsibility, nation-states are still a long way away from agreement on what they must do about climate change? There is, I believe, a clear need to rethink the language in which we frame the climate issue. We need to temper the moral universalism of cosmopolitan ethics. Too often it sets us up for unrealistic expectations, for disappointment, for disillusion. Now, it may seem strange to hear me suggest patriotism as a response to what is, as I've said, a global problem. But we do need to take more seriously the need for a patriotic moral language and nation-building narrative. And perhaps it's only fitting that we at least entertain such ideas, gathered as we are here tonight, as part of a lecture series that bears the name of one of our most significant reformers, indeed one of our great progressive nation-building prime ministers, Alfred Deakin. The mitigation of anthropogenic global warming requires from us a number of judgments about who must bear responsibility for action, about the costs of action and how they're going to be allocated, and about how the interests of present generations must be weighed against those of the future. Some philosophers have usefully described climate change as involving a perfect moral storm. It represents a convergence of factors that make it easy for us to act in morally corrupt ways. For example, it's easy for nation-states to avoid reducing their greenhouse gas emissions when there's an absence of effective global governance. We've seen this with Kyoto, we've certainly seen this with negotiations at Copenhagen more recently. What we have here is a situation that resembles the classic prisoner's dilemma, or a tragedy of the commons, where the collectively rational outcome, that of cooperation in the reduction of greenhouse gases, is likely to be trumped by the individually rational outcome, that of defection and self-interest. And the same dynamic applies across the generations. Cooperation between different generations may be, again, collectively optimal, yet the individually rational path for a given generation is to maximize its own standards of living at the expense of future ones. Now, the ethical questions that are at play here are complex. Much philosophical sweat has been exerted by ethicists and others in trying to clarify which principles must guide us, and Peter Singer spoke very eloquently about some of those possible principles. But at the risk of offering a crude take, I think we can safely say this. Even if we are to overcome the problem of moral corruption and get to the point of having some global climate change regime, it is important that a fair arrangement is reached. Developed and developing countries must strike a bargain. And there is indeed, I believe, a strong case for developed countries to bear a heavier burden. After all, historically, it has been developed countries that have generated the most greenhouse gas emissions. So if we turn back to what Peter was saying before with the historical argument, I certainly have a lot of sympathy for that view. I think there's a forward-looking argument as well for developed countries to take the lead on climate change. Because if we were to make no accommodation of the fact that different countries are at different stages of economic development, then cause for climate change action would really amount to calls from rich Western countries to poorer ones to put their economic aspirations and developmental aspirations on hold. And that would hardly be a recipe for fairness. So this then is the moral or ethical proposition of climate change action. We know that global warming, if unchecked, will have profound consequences: environmental destruction and disruption, economic and social turmoil, possible geopolitical instability. Ideally, we should be acting collectively, in timely fashion, to reduce our emissions, and developed countries, as I've said, must bear the heavier burden. Yet at this point, we might well say that the moral case for climate change action shares one thing in common with communism. And before you gasp in horror, let me assure you I'm not channeling here the philosophical wisdom of Clive Palmer. What I mean to say is that the moral cosmopolitan case for climate change action is great in theory. At the level of general principles, it just doesn't work in practice. Indeed, can acknowledging our responsibility to humanity and justice properly motivate citizens to take appropriate action? Can it motivate those in developed countries to make the sacrifices required to mitigate climate change? This, in my view, is the inescapable problem with much of the existing moral argument in favour of climate change action. It just isn't effective in getting us to change our behaviour. So let me now offer an alternative approach. First, a little about the basis from which I'm arguing. I consider myself a progressive, social democrat. I believe that the state can play an active role in designing markets. And I believe that social justice should animate the decisions we make about how we conduct our lives together, both within nations and within the broader international community of which we are part. Applied to climate change, this means two things. First, it's not enough to leave it to the market to find a way for us to mitigate our emissions. Where there is market failure, and the market is especially prone to failing when it comes to the environment, governments must play an active role in redressing the situation. Second, there's an imperative to act because climate change is likely to inflict the most harm on developing countries that are most vulnerable, or that are vulnerable to global warming and its attendant effects. Social justice in an international context really means that we can't be wholly indifferent to the plight of others. But as should be clear from my remarks at the outset, I also consider myself a patriot. I believe it's only right for us to make decisions based on the national interest. And I believe it's legitimate for us to show special concern for our country and for our compatriots. Now, my views on climate change don't conform with much of the progressive orthodoxy. Today's progressive sensibility is essentially a cosmopolitan one. It is national parochialism that gets in the way of climate change action. American intransigence to a climate deal, well, that's just the Americans seeking to minimize the cost of their obligations to contribute to mitigation. Chinese reservations about reducing their emissions, well, that's just the Chinese seeking to maximize their opportunity to secure their economic development, whatever the cost it may incur. In either case, though, the logic of the progressive response is the same. If only everyone could let go of their partial national concerns, the world would become a better place. I believe that the very opposite is true. If anything, the case for climate change action is more persuasive when it's supported by a nation-building story, by a dose of enlightened patriotism, if you will. And I don't think that progressives can afford to rest their climate change advocacy on cosmopolitan poetry. The failure of Copenhagen has only underlined the need for progressives, in particular, to reframe climate debates in more nationally focused terms. So, how can we construct a national building language to transform the case for climate change action? And more specifically, how can we build a persuasive Australian nation-building narrative on climate change? Here in Australia, I think building public support for climate change around a national story isn't as straightforward as it might sound. And I think Australians have a strange, contradictory relationship with the environment. To be sure, we often like to express our patriotism in terms of a love of the physical aspects of our country. We all love our sunburnt country. We can all wax lyrical about living in a land bathed in sunshine. But arguably, this rarely plays itself out as a concern for the environment. Our national imagination has always thought of the physical environment as something to be conquered. The Australian nation was built by felling trees, cultivating land, damming rivers, laying down roads and railways. And we've historically made our living from the land. I think we need only look at the Australian public's response to the super profits mining tax to appreciate just how powerful these currents run in our psyche. Now, all this doesn't mean that nation building and climate change action are incompatible. It's just that we need to take nation building more seriously as an applied form of patriotism. For example, we should remind ourselves that there's an obligation to pass on the patrimony that is our beloved land, our flora and fauna, our forests, our rivers. There's a patriotic obligation to live within the constraints of the land. But environmental patriotism isn't enough. It's important to have a more integrated approach to climate change, one that marries patriotism not only with environmental sustainability, but also with economic reform. And what I mean is this: we shouldn't regard carbon pricing involving an ETS and/or a carbon tax as a panacea. Any carbon mitigation program must involve coordinated action in infrastructure, in skills and training, employment generation, and regional development. Unfortunately, the preoccupation we've had in this country with the ETS has meant that climate change mitigation hasn't been positioned in the way that it should have, namely as a long-term national project of structural reform. I think a nation-building approach along the lines I've proposed here would hopefully reverse some of the conventional wisdom. For there is indeed the pervasive and powerful belief that making the transformation to a low-carbon economy will incur an unjustifiably large cost. Lower economic growth, loss of employment, reduced living standards. If we move first, so the argument runs, Australia will lose out through carbon leakage. Investment will flow to those countries that don't have to live up to stringent emissions targets. The classic prisoner's dilemma situation returns. But I think there may be, in fact, a first-mover advantage for Australia in acting sooner rather than later. And if we look at the international situation, I think we find that Australia is already some way behind. Consider, for example, Germany's efforts in developing biomass energy, or Denmark's initiatives with wind power, or Californian and Israeli efforts with solar and electric cars. The upshot of all these developments should be clear. The window for a green industry first mover advantage for Australia is closing very fast indeed. I've argued this evening that as Australians we should embrace a more muscular vision of nation building. I consider this an alternative, progressive approach to climate change. This isn't to say that nation building as a rhetoric can be something of a magic potion. It isn't. And the case for climate action will remain a genuinely difficult one to win. But the cosmopolitan language of much progressive thinking has, I believe, proven inadequate. And there's a danger that the moralising tone of much of the debate risks leading us down a path of a very dangerous form of educated despair. Now, some will no doubt say that I'm conflating the moral dimension of climate change with the political when I say that we must harness patriotism to advance climate change action. Some will no doubt say that the rhetoric of nation building may well be part of the politics of climate change, but that's separate from the ethics of the matter. Clearly, I disagree. If moral language can't motivate us to translate principles into practice, then I think it does us little good to parade our virtue. And we've perhaps overestimated the persuasiveness of cosmopolitan ethics and underestimated, I believe, the enduring power of patriotic morality. To return to that observation on cosmopolitanism I cited at the outset of my remarks, I think I'd have to agree with Herder. We'd be better off being patriotic savages than being cultivated cosmopolitan ghosts.